Claire Whitaker was 27 and had almost nothing left. 3 days after her grandfather's funeral, she stood in the Winneshiek County Courthouse while her brothers walked away smiling with the farmland, the machinery, the cattle contracts, and every asset the family had spent generations building. When the attorney finally reached her name, he slid across a worn iron key ring tagged with a single faded label that read simply, Barn. The room grew quiet before someone laughed. An abandoned timber barn built in 1884 was all that remained of her inheritance, a weathered shell everyone agreed would cost more to repair than it could ever return. Claire accepted the keys without protest because arguing had never changed anyone's opinion of her. She slipped them into the pocket beside the cracked leatherwork gloves her grandfather Walter had worn nearly every day of her childhood, gloves she had carried since the morning they buried him. They still smelled faintly of linseed oil and old pine, and holding them felt less like possessing an object than holding on to the last person who had ever looked at her as though she already belonged somewhere. She drove north that afternoon toward the family farm outside Decorah, passing harvested cornfields stripped down to pale stubble until the old red barn appeared alone above the hillside. The farmhouse windows were dark. The livestock lot stood empty. Only the barn remained upright, its silvered boards leaning gently with age but refusing to surrender. Her brothers had already signed contracts for their portions of the estate. Claire made a different choice. She unlocked the heavy sliding door, stepped into the cool silence, and decided she would save the one building nobody else believed deserved saving. Dust drifted through long shafts of afternoon light while the vast timber frames settled around her with slow wooden sighs. Then, from somewhere beneath the center of the threshing floor, came the unmistakable sound of a single hollow knock. Claire stood motionless until the sound faded into the silence of the barn. It did not resemble the loose creak of aging timber or the restless shifting that old buildings made. When the temperature changed, it had been lower, heavier, as though something solid beneath the threshing floor had answered her footsteps. Instead of rushing toward it, she set Walter's cracked leatherwork gloves on a nearby workbench and began exactly where he had taught her years ago. Never chase a mystery before making a structure safe enough to survive your curiosity. She found an old push broom leaning against the wall, its handle polished smooth by decades of use. As she swept away layers of brittle hay and dust, the faint scent of linseed oil rose from the weathered floorboards. It carried her back to a Saturday morning when she was 12, standing beside Walter while he rubbed fresh oil into a split oak beam. He had never hurried through repairs. Wood remembers every shortcut, he had told her without looking up. Treat it honestly, and it will stand longer than either of us. The memory disappeared as quickly as it had arrived when the broom struck a loose horseshoe hidden beneath the debris. Claire bent to pick it up and instinctively pulled on Walter's gloves before lifting a warped floor plank that threatened to shift under her weight. The gloves were too large, just as they had always been, but they steadied her hands in a way nothing else could. Throughout her life, people had mistaken quietness for uncertainty. Her brothers had learned to negotiate, compete, and persuade. Claire had learned to repair what others abandoned. She had never expected that skill to matter more than ambition until now. Working slowly across the center aisle, she noticed that nearly every replacement board Walter had installed over the last 15 years carried the same careful saw marks. Every board except 4. Those 4 planks were noticeably older than the surrounding floor, their edges worn smooth instead of square, as though he had intentionally preserved them while replacing everything nearby. Claire frowned. At first, she assumed the old boards had simply been too difficult to remove without damaging the frame, another practical decision by an aging farmer trying to save time. She marked their location in a small notebook anyway before continuing her inspection. Outside, the evening light faded across the harvested fields. Inside, the barn settled into its familiar silence once more. Then a thin ribbon of unexpectedly cool air brushed across the back of her hand, rising not between the old planks she had just marked, but through a narrow seam beside one massive support beam where no opening should have existed at all. Claire kept her flashlight trained on the narrow seam beside the massive support beam until the last of the daylight disappeared through the barn siding. The cool draft remained steady, but she refused to pry at the floor in fading light. Walter had spent too many years teaching her that impatience damaged more buildings than storms ever could. She covered the seam with a clean sheet of plywood to keep moisture away overnight, gathered her tools, and drove into Decorah before the hardware store closed. Her checking account held barely enough to buy roofing screws, a replacement pry bar, and 2 heavy-duty tarps. She counted every dollar twice before handing over her debit card. Winter would arrive within weeks, and if she could not stop water from entering the roof, whatever waited beneath the barn might not survive another season. On her way back, she stopped at the Winneshiek County Recorder's office, hoping to review the oldest property surveys before beginning larger repairs. The clerk located several yellowed plats from the late 19th century, but frowned when she compared them with a modern parcel map. "Funny thing," he said quietly. "Your grandfather renewed the preservation easement every single time it came due. Most people would have torn that barn down years ago." He slid the copies toward her without further explanation. Across the margin of one survey appeared a small hand-drawn square near the barn's footprint, labeled only with the letters WP. Claire assumed it referred to an old well pump that no longer existed. She folded the copies carefully into a mailing tube, unaware the notation would later mean something entirely different. Before leaving town, she visited Ben Holloway, a retired timber frame craftsman who had repaired nearly every historic barn in the county. Ben studied the photographs on her phone for a long moment before nodding toward the central support beam. "That old frame still wants to stand," he said. "Just remember something. Not every space under an old barn was meant to stay forgotten, but some were meant to stay protected." Claire smiled politely, interpreting the warning as practical advice about unstable foundations. Ben did not elaborate. He simply handed her a small moisture meter and refused payment, telling her to return it whenever the work was finished. Back at the farm, the first cold drizzle of late October had begun to fall, tapping softly across the weathered roof. Claire parked beside the silent barn and sat for a moment with Walter's cracked leatherwork gloves resting across the steering wheel. Selling the property would erase her debts. Walking away would be easy. Instead, she pulled the gloves onto her hands, lifted the rolled tarps from the truck bed, and chose the harder future. She climbed the worn exterior ladder, secured the worst section of roof against the approaching rain, then descended into the quiet interior once more. Water no longer dripped onto the center aisle. The barn seemed almost grateful for the temporary shelter. Carrying her flashlight toward the great support beam, she knelt beside the narrow seam where the cool air continued to rise. This time, when her gloved fingers brushed the timber, they found the smooth edge of an iron bar hidden perfectly within the old frame, waiting where only someone repairing the barn instead of abandoning it would ever think to reach. Claire wrapped both hands around the hidden iron bar and resisted the urge to pull. Every instinct born from years beside Walter reminded her that old structures rarely forgave impatient hands. Instead, she switched on her flashlight, brushed away another layer of dust, and studied the timber surrounding the bar inch by inch. The iron had been forged by hand, not machine-cut, its surface worn smooth where countless fingers could have gripped it decades earlier. Yet the oak around it showed almost no splitting. Someone had designed the mechanism to move without damaging the frame, then concealed it so completely that no casual visitor would ever notice it. Before touching anything again, Claire used Ben Holloway's moisture meter along the central beam and surrounding floor. The readings surprised her. Despite years of leaking roof panels and Iowa winters, the heavy timber directly beside the hidden bar remained remarkably dry, while neighboring beams carried normal moisture levels for an aging barn. It made no practical sense. Water should have reached this section first. She crouched lower, following the grain until she noticed a second inconsistency. For floorboards surrounding the beam had been worn smooth by generations of boots, but the narrow strip immediately beside the hidden bar retained unusually sharp edges beneath its dust, as though it had been lifted occasionally and then carefully cleaned before being hidden again. Walter had never mentioned any concealed mechanism. He had never needed to. Claire set the flashlight on a hay bale and began addressing the task that actually threatened the building. Rainwater still pooled against the limestone foundation outside the eastern wall. Using an old trenching shovel she found hanging near the doorway, she spent nearly 2 hours reopening a drainage channel that had filled with leaves and packed soil over many seasons. Cold water finally began flowing away from the foundation instead of pressing against it. The work exhausted her shoulders, but each foot of cleared trench meant another winter the old barn might survive. Somewhere during the steady rhythm of digging, her purpose shifted without her noticing. She had arrived believing she was protecting the only inheritance she possessed because she had nowhere else to go. Now she found herself protecting the barn because it had endured long enough to deserve someone who refused to abandon it. By the time she returned inside, darkness had settled across the valley. She hung a battery lantern from an overhead brace and ate a simple sandwich while studying the original framing. The construction fascinated her. Mortise and tenon joints fit together with remarkable precision, yet one section of the central support system used white oak, while every neighboring beam had been cut from old-growth red oak. Different species, different aging patterns, different builders, perhaps, or one builder working decades later with a specific purpose. She unfolded the 19th century survey copies she had borrowed from the recorder's office and compared them with the interior layout. The small square marked WP should have aligned with the eastern wall if it represented a well pump, yet it rested almost exactly beneath the center of the threshing floor instead. Claire frowned, convinced the surveyor had simply made a drafting error. She circled the notation anyway before sliding the papers safely into a waterproof sleeve. As she packed away her tools, the lantern light caught something nearly invisible high on the massive center beam. Someone had carved a row of tiny date marks into the wood, one for nearly every autumn over the past 15 years. Each mark was neat, deliberate, and finished with the same careful knife stroke. The final mark stopped halfway through its last line, as though the hand carving it had never returned to complete the year. Walter had been too ill to climb into the barn during his final autumn. Yet the unfinished mark was fresh enough that its pale wood had barely begun to darken, forcing Claire to realize one quiet fact she could no longer explain. Someone had continued caring for the hidden heart of the barn long after everyone believed it had been left completely alone. Claire stood beneath the unfinished row of date marks until the lantern battery dimmed enough to remind her that wonder alone would not keep an old barn standing. The next morning she began where Walter always had, with work that could be measured. She replaced 2 broken roof battens using reclaimed oak stacked behind the machine shed, tightened loose braces along the eastern wall, and packed fresh limestone into sections of the drainage trench that had begun to collapse overnight. Every repair bought the building another season. Every hour spent preserving it made the hidden questions feel less like an interruption and more like part of the barn itself. Late that afternoon, Ben Holloway drove slowly up the gravel lane in an aging pickup, returning only because Claire had called to ask about matching 19th century joinery rather than asking him to do the work for her. He watched quietly while she cut a replacement tenon by hand, checked the fit once, then shaved away barely the thickness of a pencil mark before seating the beam cleanly into place. Ben smiled for the first time. Walter would have approved of that. He offered no praise beyond those 4 words, yet they carried more weight than any compliment Claire had received in years. Before leaving, he walked once around the center bay, stopped beneath the carved dates, and rested his hand against the great support beam without speaking. When Claire asked whether he recognized the markings, he answered only, "Some promises are counted one season at a time." Then he climbed back into his truck and drove away, leaving the sentence behind like another unfinished clue. That evening, Claire slipped Walter's cracked leatherwork gloves into her back pocket, instead of wearing them, while she sorted through an old cabinet that had collapsed against the west wall. Beneath rusted harness buckles and broken lantern parts, she discovered a narrow ledger wrapped in oilcloth. Most of its pages listed ordinary maintenance expenses, but every autumn entry ended with the same brief notation: hard inspected. Drain clear. Waiting continues. There was never an explanation of what was waiting, nor who had written the words after Walter's handwriting gradually weakened during his final years. The gloves suddenly felt different in her hands. They no longer represented only the grandfather she had lost. They connected her to a duty someone had continued long after illness should have made the work impossible. Claire spread the ledger beside the 19th century survey and her notebook. The unfinished date marks, the mysterious WP notation, the cool draft beneath the threshing floor, the unusually dry timber, and the repeated references to the heart of the barn no longer looked like separate puzzles. They pointed patiently toward the same place beneath her feet. For the first time, she stopped wondering whether something was hidden below the barn and began planning how to reach it without destroying whatever generations before her had worked so carefully to protect. Claire waited until the following Saturday before touching the hidden mechanism again. She wanted full daylight, a dry floor, fresh batteries for the lanterns, and every repair from the previous week completed first. The roof no longer leaked above the center bay. The drainage trench carried rainwater safely downhill, and the old timber frame felt steady beneath her boots. Only then did she slip Walter's cracked leatherwork gloves onto her hands, kneel beside the great support beam, and wrap her fingers around the concealed iron bar. This time she noticed something she had overlooked before. The forged handle did not pull outward. It rotated a quarter turn with surprising ease before stopping against an unseen catch. A dull wooden click echoed somewhere beneath the threshing floor. Claire remained perfectly still, listening. Nothing shifted overhead. No beam groaned under unexpected strain. Following the grain of the surrounding oak, she found a narrow finger joint almost invisible beneath generations of dust. Working slowly with her pry bar, she lifted only the 4 preserved floorboards Walter had never replaced. They rose together as a single framed panel, revealing carefully fitted limestone steps descending into darkness. Cool, dry air drifted upward, carrying the faint scent of old cedar and machine oil instead of damp earth. The hidden cellar beneath the barn had never flooded. Someone had engineered it to remain dry for generations. Claire lowered a lantern first, then climbed carefully down the worn stone staircase. The room below was larger than she expected, its walls built from tightly fitted limestone blocks, its heavy oak shelves still standing. Nothing looked abandoned. Wooden document boxes rested in orderly rows. Glass preserving jars held tightly rolled survey maps. Wax-sealed bundles of letters were arranged by year rather than by family name. An iron cabinet contained leather-bound farm ledgers beside neatly labeled veterinary notebooks. Resting against the far wall stood the original brass boundary marker shown on the 19th century survey, still wrapped in protective cloth. Every object suggested planning instead of concealment born from fear. Claire removed one glove before gently opening the nearest document box. Inside lay dozens of folded maintenance records spanning decades. The handwriting changed gradually as Walter aged, but one pattern never disappeared. Every few years another page mentioned the barn's heart, the drainage, the cellar, and preparations for the caretaker. None of the entries explained who that caretaker would be. None mentioned money. Then, beneath the final ledger, she found a small linen envelope tied with faded blue ribbon. Across its front, written in Walter Whitaker's unmistakable hand, were only 6 quiet words. For Claire, when the barn is ready. Claire looked at the linen envelope for a long time before she untied the faded blue ribbon. The words on its front had already changed something inside her. For Claire, when the barn is ready. Not when the cellar is opened. Not when I am gone. Walter had written when the barn is ready, as though the building itself had been part of the decision. She slipped the ribbon free but did not unfold the pages. Instead, she placed the envelope beside his cracked leatherwork gloves on the broad oak table at the center of the cellar. Walter had spent a lifetime teaching her that conclusions came last. Evidence came first. The room around her had survived because someone had respected that order. She intended to do the same. She began with the ledgers. There were 12 of them, each covering several years, their leather bindings darkened by cedar oil and careful handling. The earliest volumes recorded ordinary farm life with remarkable precision. Feed deliveries, fence repairs, milk production, drainage work, timber purchases. The handwriting remained calm regardless of drought, flood, or difficult harvest. Nothing suggested a hidden inheritance. Yet every October, usually within a week of the first frost, one brief entry appeared in exactly the same place. Heart inspected. Drain clear. Waiting continues. Claire copied every occurrence into her notebook before arranging them chronologically. The pattern stretched across nearly 30 years. The wording barely changed. What did change were the surrounding expenses. Every autumn inspection coincided with purchases of limestone, cedar oil, mortar, or replacement drainage tile. Earlier, she had assumed Walter had been obsessively maintaining an old barn because sentiment outweighed practicality. Looking across 3 decades of records at once revealed something different. Those materials were not improving the visible structure. They were preserving the dry conditions beneath it. The cellar itself had been the true maintenance project all along. That realization quietly reshaped another memory. The unfinished repairs scattered throughout the barn no longer looked like jobs Walter had become too old to finish. They looked intentional. He had repaired only what the hidden room required to remain protected, leaving everything else weathered enough that no investor, developer, or curious visitor would see the barn as unusually valuable. Claire rested one gloved hand on the nearest ledger without noticing she had done so. For years those gloves had represented absence. Now they lay among the records like another working tool, connecting every inspection recorded in ink to the hands that had performed it. She turned next to the rolled survey maps stored inside the glass-preserving jars. Their careful packaging surprised her almost as much as their condition. Each map had been wrapped in waxed linen before being placed inside the jar, keeping moisture away for decades. She laid them across the long table in order of date. The oldest survey, prepared shortly after the barn was built, included every fence line, orchard row, drainage ditch, and livestock lane. Near the exact center of the barn appeared the small notation she had already noticed, WP. The second survey repeated it. So did the third. But by the late 1950s, the letters disappeared from every official revision while remaining visible on Walter's private copies. Claire measured the distances using Walter's old steel tape, aligning each map against the limestone walls around her. The location never changed. Only the public record did. Earlier she had believed someone had tried to erase the hidden space. Now she wondered whether the omission had served another purpose entirely. If the cellar depended on remaining dry and undisturbed, perhaps removing one insignificant notation from public drawings had simply discouraged unnecessary questions without altering the legal description of the property. The discovery answered one mystery while opening another. Someone had understood both construction and county records well enough to protect the room without hiding the farm itself. That required planning, not secrecy born from fear. Claire carefully rolled the surveys again before reaching for the oldest journal Walter had kept for himself rather than for the farm. Unlike the ledgers, these pages contained observations instead of transactions. He almost never wrote about emotions directly. He wrote about work. Yet through the work, another story slowly emerged. At age 9, Claire insisted on replacing a cracked handle instead of throwing away a hammer. At 12, she noticed that one white oak beam carried weight differently from the surrounding red oak. At 16, she argued that old joinery should be repaired rather than replaced because every original cut told part of the building's history. Walter never praised those moments. He simply recorded them. Reading them together, Claire began to recognize something she had missed while growing up. He had not been documenting her accomplishments. He had been documenting her habits. Patience, care, observation. The very qualities required to understand the room beneath the barn. She slowly closed the journal and looked once more around the quiet cellar. For the first time since opening its hidden entrance, she realized she had probably been asking the wrong question. The mystery was no longer what had been hidden here. The deeper mystery had become why every small decision above the barn had been arranged to ensure that only one particular kind of person would ever find it. Claire did not open Walter's letter yet. Doing so now would have been the easiest way forward, but nothing she had seen inside the cellar suggested Walter had intended the truth to rest inside a single envelope. Every shelf argued against that idea. Every carefully labeled box, every rolled survey, every ledger preserved beneath cedar boards seemed to insist that the story could only be understood by assembling its pieces in the proper order. She returned the letter to the center of the table and reached instead for a narrow bundle of photographs tied together with faded cotton tape. Most showed ordinary farm life. Children standing beside milk cows. Hay wagons lined along the ridge before harvest. Winter repairs carried out beneath drifting snow. At first they seemed unrelated to the cellar, until she noticed that the barn appeared in nearly every photograph. She spread them across the table according to the estimated year each had been taken. The building slowly changed as decades passed. New siding appeared. Windows disappeared. The roofline was repaired after one particularly severe storm. Yet one feature never changed. The center bay remained untouched. Even when nearly every visible section of the barn received replacement lumber, the heavy white oak beam near the hidden mechanism remained exactly where it had always been. Claire remembered the journal entry she had read only minutes earlier. At 16, she had argued that original joinery deserved preservation whenever possible. At the time, she believed Walter had simply enjoyed hearing a stubborn granddaughter sound like an old carpenter. Now the memory carried another meaning. Walter had not merely been teaching restoration. He had been teaching her how to recognize which parts of a building should never be altered. She turned one photograph over. Walter had written only a date and a single sentence beneath it. The center always stays true. Nothing else. No explanation. No names. The sentence echoed quietly against another clue she had already collected. Heart inspected. Drain clear. Waiting continues. The words had once sounded like routine maintenance. They no longer did. She crossed the cellar and examined the limestone walls more closely. Their surfaces carried the irregular marks of 19th-century hand tools, but the mortar joints looked remarkably consistent. Someone had repointed them again and again over many decades, always using the same lime mixture. She compared the color against unopened bags of repair mortar recorded in Walter's purchase ledgers. The composition matched almost perfectly. That answered another question. Every autumn inspection had not been ceremonial. It had been preventative. The cellar survived because each generation repaired tiny failures before they became visible. Preservation, she realized, had been an act of quiet repetition rather than dramatic rescue. The realization made her climb back into the barn one more time before sunset. Standing beneath the massive center beam, she looked upward instead of down. The unfinished row of carved date marks stretched across the weathered timber exactly as she had copied them into her notebook. Earlier, she had believed they marked inspections completed by Walter alone. The photograph had already challenged that assumption. Now the spacing between the cuts challenged it again. Measuring carefully with Walter's old folding rule, she discovered that every mark occupied almost identical intervals from the previous one. They had not been carved freehand year after year. Someone had first scribed tiny guide points almost invisible beneath the aged finish, then cut each annual mark against them with deliberate precision. Walter had planned decades ahead, or someone had planned alongside him. Claire rested one gloved hand against the beam. The worn leather settled naturally into a shallow depression polished smooth by countless seasons of work. It fit so perfectly that she could almost imagine Walter standing in exactly the same place every October, checking the drainage, inspecting the frame, then marking another year completed. But the final mark still ended halfway through its line. Walter had been too ill to finish it. Someone else had finished every inspection after that. Yet they had refused to finish the carving. They had preserved the interruption exactly as it had been left, as though completing that final stroke would have broken a promise instead of honoring one. Claire looked back toward the concealed floor panel. She had entered the cellar believing she was reconstructing an old family secret. Instead, every new piece of evidence suggested she was standing inside a promise that had never belonged to one man alone. The question waiting ahead was no longer whether Walter had trusted her. It was why another person had chosen to protect that trust after Walter no longer could. Claire left her hand against the center beam for another moment before returning to the cellar. The unfinished carving no longer looked like an abandoned task. It looked like a decision. Whoever had continued Walter's yearly inspections had deliberately refused to complete the final mark, preserving the exact moment when Walter's own hands could no longer finish the ritual. That single omission echoed the careful restraint she had found everywhere else. Nothing in the cellar had been improved for appearance. Everything had been preserved for meaning. She carried the folding rule, the photograph, and Walter's gloves back to the long oak table. The lantern light revealed details she had overlooked the previous evening. The photograph of Walter and Henry Foster had been mounted on thicker paper than the others. Its corners carried tiny pinholes, suggesting it had once been displayed rather than stored. She compared the pin spacing with a small wooden notice board fixed beside the cellar shelves. For empty holes remained in the board, matching the photograph almost perfectly. For years, perhaps decades, that picture had hung where anyone maintaining the cellar would see it before beginning the annual inspection. It had never been intended as a keepsake. It had been a reminder. Claire unfolded the inventory Walter had left inside the envelope and read it more slowly. Every document listed below corresponded to an object already resting in the cellar. Beside each entry, Walter had recorded where it originated, who delivered it, and the date it entered the collection. The brass boundary marker had come directly from the original survey crew after a fence realignment. The veterinary notebooks had belonged to Walter's father. The earliest journals had passed from his grandfather before him. Nothing had appeared without explanation. Nothing depended upon memory alone. The collection had been built piece by piece across generations, each caretaker preserving evidence rather than stories. Claire suddenly understood why Walter had cataloged everything instead of writing one long account. Evidence could survive doubt. Memory could not. She reached for the oldest property survey once again, laying it beside the newest official plat she had copied from the county recorder's office. This time she ignored the missing WP notation. Instead, she compared the legal descriptions line by line. Every bearing, every distance, every corner monument remained unchanged across nearly 70 years. Henry Foster had removed only the reference itself. The property had never been altered. The hidden room had simply disappeared from public attention while remaining protected inside the farm's ordinary maintenance records. It was an elegant solution. Nothing had been falsified. Nothing illegal had occurred. The cellar had survived because it had quietly become unremarkable. That realization brought another memory into focus. Ben Holloway had once warned her that some places were meant to stay protected rather than forgotten. At the time, she had interpreted his words as advice about unstable foundations. Now she heard something entirely different. Protection had never required secrecy from everyone. It required discretion from the few who understood what was being preserved. Claire climbed back into the barn carrying only Walter's gloves. Standing beneath the center beam, she slipped them onto her hands once more and rested her palm against the polished depression worn into the white oak. The fit was exact. Without thinking, she looked toward the eastern wall where the drainage trench disappeared beneath the grass. Walter and Henry had walked that route every October before entering the barn. The journals, ledgers, surveys, and photographs all described the same sequence. Drainage first, structure second, cellar last. Not because the documents were more valuable than the building, but because without the building there would have been no cellar left to protect. The order itself was part of the promise. For years Claire had believed. Walter loved the barn because it contained a secret. Standing beneath the quiet timbers, she finally understood the opposite. The secret had survived because Walter loved the barn. The thought stayed with Claire long after darkness settled across the farm. She returned to the cellar and finally unfolded Walter's 2 handwritten pages. They contained no dramatic confession, no hidden fortune, and no explanation that solved the mystery by itself. Instead, Walter had written only instructions. Read nothing here without comparing it to the ledgers. Trust no memory that cannot be matched to a record. Preserve the building before preserving the papers. The words felt unmistakably like him. Even now, he refused to let a single document become the entire story. Claire smiled quietly and placed the letter beside the ledgers once again. It belonged with the evidence, not above it. She spent the next several hours following Walter's advice exactly. First, she compared every inventory entry against the objects resting on the cellar shelves. Every journal matched its catalog number. Every survey map corresponded to the inventory. Every photograph appeared in chronological order. Nothing was missing. Then she compared the inventory dates with the maintenance ledgers. Each time a document entered the cellar, a corresponding maintenance entry appeared within the same season. The sequence remained unbroken for decades. Finally, she matched those dates against the carved marks on the center beam above. Once again, the rhythm held perfectly until Walter's final autumn. The pattern had become impossible to dismiss as coincidence. The yearly inspection, the drainage repairs, the ledger entries, the carved marks, and the catalog updates all belonged to one continuous act of stewardship repeated year after year. Only one question remained. Why had Henry Foster agreed to continue it? Claire returned to the photograph. This time she ignored the 2 men entirely and studied the background instead. Behind Walter and Henry stood the barn exactly as it had looked 15 years earlier. The repaired siding was familiar. The roofline matched old photographs. But something else caught her attention. Resting against the eastern foundation was a surveyor's tripod. She hurried back to the rolled maps and located the year written beneath the photograph. It matched the same season Henry removed the WP notation from the county copies. Claire laid the photograph, the official plat, Walter's private survey, and Henry's revision notes side by side. None of them contradicted one another anymore. They completed one another. Henry had not erased evidence. He had protected its location while preserving every legal boundary exactly as before. Walter had not asked him to conceal ownership. He had asked him to prevent unnecessary attention from falling upon the cellar until the right caretaker arrived. The realization transformed another memory. Claire suddenly understood why Walter had never pressured her to compete with her brothers for the profitable parts of the farm. He had quietly invested years teaching her timber framing, drainage, joinery, and preservation instead. Those lessons had never been hobbies. They had been preparation. Had Claire inherited the cropland instead, she might have leased it within months. Had she inherited machinery, she might eventually have sold it for newer equipment. But the neglected barn demanded something different. It required patience before reward, responsibility before ownership, and care before curiosity. Walter had trusted that only one grandchild would willingly choose that path. The weight of that realization settled gently rather than dramatically. Claire removed Walter's gloves once more and placed them on the table beside the unfinished inventory, not as relics of a man she had lost, but beside the work he had expected someone else to continue. For the first time in her life, she no longer measured her worth against what her brothers had received. She measured it against the quiet confidence Walter had placed in her long before the reading of his will. Yet one decision remained. Everything now pointed toward a truth larger than the Whitaker family alone. The preserved surveys, journals, and chain of custody deserved careful historical authentication. At the same time, the cellar had survived because generations had resisted the temptation to rush ahead of the evidence. Claire stood in the center of the silent room, looking from the shelves of carefully preserved records to the stone stair leading back into the barn above. She could announce the discovery immediately and allow others to shape its meaning before every piece had been understood. Or she could complete Walter's work exactly as he had intended, preserving both the building and its history until the evidence could speak with one clear voice. Standing between those two paths, she realized the inheritance Walter had truly left her was not the barn beneath the Iowa hillside. It was the responsibility to decide how the truth should enter the world. Claire did not make her decision that afternoon. Instead, she climbed the stone steps, lowered the hidden floor panel back into place, and stood alone beneath the great white oak beam until the last light drifted through the weathered siding. The barn had become quiet again, exactly as it had been when she first unlocked its doors. Only now the silence no longer felt empty. It felt complete. Over the next several weeks, she followed Walter's final lesson with the same patience that had guided every discovery before it. She delivered certified copies of the inventories, surveys, maintenance ledgers, and journals to Eleanor Briggs at the County Historical Archive, while every original document remained protected beneath the barn according to Walter's catalog. The documented chain of custody, preserved without interruption across generations, allowed each record to be authenticated in its proper order. The restored boundary was quietly recognized through the existing legal process. The preserved easement remained exactly where Walter had wanted it. Any financial benefit that followed became a practical means of maintaining the property rather than the reason for keeping it. Claire never hurried the process, because she finally understood that Walter had spent decades proving one simple truth. History deserved stewardship before celebration. When her brothers returned, expecting another conversation about land values and inheritance, Claire led them through the barn. Without accusation, she showed them the repaired drainage trench before the restored roof. She pointed out the preserved white oak beam before mentioning the hidden cellar below. Finally, she placed the ledgers on the old workbench and allowed Walter's careful records to speak where arguments never could. Neither brother interrupted. They recognized their grandfather's handwriting long before they finished reading the first pages. For the first time since the reading of the will, no one compared acres, machinery, or money. They simply stood together inside the building all three of them had once taken for granted, each understanding a different part of the same story. Claire asked for nothing in return. She no longer needed anyone to confirm what Walter had already entrusted to her. Before winter settled fully across Winneshiek County, work began to preserve the old bank barn exactly as Walter had hoped. Local apprentices learned traditional timber framing beneath Ben Holloway's patient guidance. Eleanor Briggs helped organize the historical records without removing them from the cellar built to protect them. Visitors came not to search for hidden treasure, but to understand how one family's careful stewardship had preserved a small piece of Iowa's agricultural history. On the morning the restoration was officially completed, Claire climbed the familiar ladder beside the center beam, carrying Walter's cracked leatherwork gloves one final time. She brushed away a trace of fresh sawdust, folded the gloves carefully, and hung them on the original wooden peg overlooking the threshing floor where generations of inspections had begun. This time she did not leave them behind because she was ready to say goodbye. She left them there because they had finally returned home. As she stepped back, a young apprentice reached instinctively for a broom before beginning the day's work, just as Walter always had. Claire smiled but said nothing. Some lessons did not need explaining. Late that afternoon, she crossed the center of the barn once more and paused where she had first heard the lonely hollow knock beneath her feet. The hidden cellar remained safely below, no longer a secret waiting to be discovered, but a promise faithfully kept. She slipped the old iron keys into her pocket, pulled the great sliding door closed, and listened as the weathered timbers settled into their familiar, gentle sigh. Months earlier she had believed she was locking away the only inheritance nobody wanted. Now she understood she was protecting the one place that had been waiting, patiently and faithfully, for her to come home.